Okay, for my choice article, I chose 10 practice tips for making fractions come alive and make sense. And I chose this article because I personally feel like I have a poor relationship with fractions. I find them difficult to understand. And through this article, I learned the reason why I probably have a negative relationship with fractions. And I learned a few tips that I could use as a future teacher to help my students not have this poor relationship with fractions. So uh, first is the discussion of fractions and mathematical struggle. So teachers struggle to understand fractions just as much as students struggle. And just because there's a struggle doesn't mean that they're not important. Even though it's hard, we should still try to understand them. The lack of understanding fractions leads to trouble teaching fractions, which creates the cycle of struggle. And then the overall goal is to get the students to understand why and what fractions are, not just how to solve problems with them, which I personally feel like is a large issue, is that we aren't really taught why, we're just kind of taught how to use them and what they mean on a surface level. So in this article, it explains some tips for teachers to use. So the first one is explaining the numerator and the denominator. So to help students better understand fractions, I can set a generalized rule about them. The rule should be used to explain what a numerator and a denominator is and what they represent. We're often taught that the reasoning of part whole, so that the numerator is part of the whole denominator, which is fine for whole numbers, but it becomes confusing with improper fractions. So instead of referring to the denominator as the whole, we can say it's the size or the name. The next tip is fractions on a number line. So number lines allow for students to see how fractions relate to whole numbers. Fractions on number lines are often more overlooked than rational numbers because rational numbers are easier to identify. We're taught them from a very young age, so we already know what rational numbers are. Using number lines allows for students to see whole numbers, fractions, and decimals all together, and it's a great way to compare and contrast these numbers. So you can show the point of how a decimal percent and fractions are all equal on a number line. The next tip is to offer different models. So students learn differently, so offering different ways to show fractions can help each student understand what fractions are. You can use different manipulatives and different activities to provide a better understanding. So some different manipulatives would be fraction bars. You could use sheets of paper, so like folding them or dividing them, making half of the sheet of paper or 1/4 of the sheet of paper. You can use shapes, and then there are dozens of websites and apps online that you can use different manipulatives on. So it's important when using the manipulatives to give students actual problems, because so they don't get distracted. So they don't see the manipulative and think like, oh, I can just draw on the paper, fold it into a paper airplane, or I can just play games on the computer. But when you give them an actual problem, they know what they're supposed to be doing. The next tip is to talk to your students. So having one-on-one discussions with your students allows you to see their mathematical thinking. This also helps create that relationship, so they'll feel more comfortable to let you know when they're not understanding something. Through these conversations, you can determine their understanding of fractions and predict their future understanding. These one-to-one discussions allow the teacher to see mathematical reasoning behind their thoughts, which can help both the student understand and the teacher understand better, so the teacher can understand where the student's coming from and why they're confused or what they're confused on. The last tip is to make real world connections. So students often find decimals or percents easier to use than fractions. This is fine, but it can be helpful to show the relationship between fractions, decimals, and percents. So these connections can be made through discussing building. If you're doing some type of construction, you can bring that in, using money, and then dividing. So in conclusion, I learned the importance of understanding what a fraction truly is and how this knowledge can help me teach my students in the future. Through my understanding, one-on-one discussions, generalized rules, and different manipulatives, I can better teach my students fractions and create a knowledge where they genuinely understand what fractions are and why fractions are.